Today, I'm going to give you a critical lecture about archives. The lecture is going to be in two parts. The first will mostly be quite abstract. I'm going to introduce you to some very broad questions around archives, about what they are and why they might be an important object of criticism. In the second section, as I move through a number of criticisms of archives, I will do so in a way that is rather more attached to some questions of art. Specifically, I'm going to think through some issues in relation to photography in general and documentary photography in particular. Most of you will never have visited an archive. Nonetheless, almost all of you will have an idea in your heads of what an archive is like. A municipal building somewhere, probably brutalist and a little run down, with not quite enough windows. It will contain an enormous store of boxes and files, all kept in order, and each file and box will in turn be filled with paper, also kept in order. Perhaps you imagine an old-fashioned catalogue made of hand-typed index cards. Perhaps you just imagine the smell of dust, the feel of brittle, yellowed pages. Perhaps you imagine having to ask someone how to find what you want, and you have an idea of all of this history somehow locked away and kept out of sight in this place that you have never visited. Today I want to get you thinking a bit critically about what an archive is, why we have them, what work they do, how we might use them, and what problems they might cause us. It might seem peculiar to you that I have come to you today to lecture you about how to criticise an archive. Who is this strange man with a hat and glasses and a beard, and why is he bothering to argue with a municipal building full of paper on the edge of town? What could possibly be wrong with this place I go to in order to find out some information about history? So I'm going to have to expand the terrain a little. I'd like to start with a very broad idea of an archive. Maybe I can give you a definition. An archive is a site where historical information is stored and where it is ordered in such a way that it can be retrieved. You can probably see that with a definition like this, all sorts of sites might be understood to be archives. If I showed you my notebook, with all of my notes of the lectures and seminars that we have had through the semester, that would be an archive of sorts. Maybe not everything is in order, and I could create a contents page and an index for what it contains, so that the information held there is easier for me to find. That might make me a good archivist, at least of my notes. My email inbox is a sort of archive too, of all the strange little conversations I've had with people through my screen and keyboard, and a constant and sometimes painful reminder of all the messages I've left unanswered too. You'll know that your hard drives are also a sort of archive, arranged to organise and retrieve information encoded into their systems. Now think of all those grand systems of organised information, of records to be searched, that in turn seem to organise our world. It is probably necessary to also mention that even though the archive might seem like a sort of obvious and natural phenomenon, it in fact has a very particular history. So let's historicise it a little. Perhaps you noticed that I mentioned index cards at the opening of this lecture. Some of you might be too young to know what an index card is, but I recommend that you buy some and see if you find them useful as a technology for making records. The index card was invented by a guy called Carl Linnaeus in the 1730s, who you might have come across if you ever studied biology. He was one of the first people who tried to map all the different forms of life, according to kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, family and species. Here's an image of his cards for urtica, the stinging nettle. So he was interested in imposing a sort of informational ordering system on life itself, and he used index cards to deal with the vast amount of information about all the animals, the plants, the fungi, and so on. Always a question about where the bluebird and the seaweed belong, so that the human can come to know them, understand them, and recognise them. But what is crucial also in thinking about the index card as a technology for classification is that the reason for its shape, the fact that it is not a book, is that the object of study is so enormously complex, and that knowledge about it remains unfinished and perhaps even unfinishable. So just as Linnaeus is involved in designing the sorts of classifications, schemata, that can contain the whole of life in all its variety, he is also developing a technology of records that admits that its work will always be incomplete, and that additions may be required not just at the end, but anywhere in the middle as more become known, and the whole set of information can be reordered accordingly. About 50 years later, after Linnaeus, the index card was picked up and developed into a way of organising information about information made by humans, by which I mean the court library in Vienna, in Austria, introduces its first card catalogue to help to organise all the books. You can see how much better this is than a book to record new books, with each new addition to the collection placed at the end. The index card allows you to reorganise your records, making things much easier to find and reorganise later. Now, it was certainly also the case that very old institutions had for a long time kept some kind of record of their activities. And I'm thinking of institutions like the church, of universities, courts, and aristocratic dynasties. But what I want you to realise is that this trend towards what we might call the rational organisation of all information has its roots relatively recently, only about 250 years ago, in the 18th century. It's part of a movement called the Enlightenment, which also saw the invention of the encyclopedia and the development of dictionaries of various kinds, and which very much emphasised knowledge in place of faith, belief, or custom. Here's a diagram for a taxonomy of human thought itself, from the encyclopedia made in France by Diderot and D'Alembert, among others. There's a sort of politics to these projects too, a sense that those old institutions of the church, the aristocracy, the courts under feudal rule, were all understood to be closed, corrupt, dogmatic, and self-interested. They were all involved in blocking democratic, open, and equal control over life, the law, education, and so on. And in the case of the development of archives, this politics is incredibly explicit. The French National Archive is founded in late July 1789, right in the middle of the French Revolution, 2 weeks after the storming of the Bastille. And really, this Enlightenment impulse and the bourgeois revolutionary impulse are part of the same phenomenon. Just 2 weeks after the storming of the Bastille, people are having a conversation about the need to store records of the new state publicly, now that all those old institutions, the church, the aristocracy, the monarchy, are being overcome. And now that people have looted all the papers and records from grand old houses and palaces and churches, they need a new home. So, when we see a state archive, it is normally part of a bourgeois, liberal, Enlightenment politics. Even if you don't have much of an interest in archives, I really want you to try to think here about how they come out of a view that believes that it matters that information about history should be held publicly, in a way that is rationally ordered, and that this thought is directed against very concrete forms of tyranny. And perhaps you can think too about our own time, and how the privatisation of certain types of information, by states no longer committed to democracy, or by corporations, represents something like a renewal of those old tyrannical ways. I can maybe add to that also that this is a time when history itself becomes increasingly important to how people want to organise human affairs. With the bourgeois revolutions, and I'm thinking here mainly of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the main means by which life had been organised, through religious institutions, through hereditary power, and through custom, are all swept away, and suddenly, in this clearing, a relation to history itself becomes important. Perhaps one way to think about this is that at that very moment, history was simply a way to know all those old forms of old inequalities, of old corruption, of old dogmas, and the ability to know becomes a way of guarding against their return. Irrational orders are replaced by rational ones, private orders by public ones. When these revolutions happen, people start talking about making history in their own terms. You can go along with everything that I've told you so far, and you might believe what I have told you, that it is very important that we conserve all these records, that we order them so that they can be easily retrieved, and that we make them accessible to those who come later. You might think that this sort of thing would make the past accessible to you, as a member of the public and as a citizen. All well and good. But today, I want to point to some problems that arise in relation to the archival mode. You probably already have some sense of them, since your view onto the world is often through a sort of archive. Today, the largest companies in the world are almost all metadata companies. By this, I simply mean that their business is in the categorization and organisation of data and information for search and retrieval. You're probably aware too that it turns out that the transformation of everything into data, into yet more information to be searched, involves a certain sort of reduction of life. Within these schemes of rationalisation or pseudo-rationalisation, the reduction of real life to information entails what the sociologist Max Weber called disenchantment. Life itself is lost. Yet, I insist, I am not just my profile, my data trace across 1,000 screens. It might try to capture me, but it misses. And yet, in quite another way, I find myself perpetually captured by it, unable to think or understand without its ordering of information, its structuring of knowledge, which catches just the trace and not the truth. Perhaps you are all too young, having all been born into a world of superabundant archivalism, or even better, into the archival space that was all that was left after the world itself ended, where everything you thought was real was merely a trace, the world made data. Two dating profiles are algorithmically matched in order that they can get together and hopefully have a data child capable of inaugurating an email address, all of its own, being surveilled and traced as profile, as influencer, as mere connection, generating new data until it too will one day have a dating profile of its own, ready to be algorithmically matched. Last week, during my seminar on feminism, I was struck by something that a student said. They said, "There has been so much progress since the 1970s. We have to protect what has been won and build on it." The reason I found this argument striking, in a way, was that it accorded with what became the most common Enlightenment way of thinking. The world is in a constant state of progress and reform, but that progress is fragile and can only be defended by getting to know history. But what was shocking to me about this view of feminism was that it disagreed with another view that I had so often heard. For many years, I worked building archives of social movements in and around the women's liberation movement. I would collect magazines and news sheets, agitational materials and posters, traces of art projects, manifestos and flyers. If you have been to see the Women in Revolt exhibition, which is currently on in Edinburgh, you will have a sense of the tremendous material, media and artistic production of this movement, as well as its archival presentation in the contemporary art space. Often my work involved getting to know women who were involved in producing these objects as part of that movement. Lots of them disagreed with each other back then, and many of them disagree with each other on all sorts of issues even now, even as most of them are in their 70s and 80s, and a lot of them are still politically active. But if there was one thing that they almost all agreed about, it was that the women's liberation movement failed. The type of freedom that they had spent a period of their life fighting for was never made into a reality. By the mid-1980s, the movement was dead. Indeed, even where there had been victories, and one might think here about how it was not until 1975 that women in this country were able to open a bank account in their own name, or to take out personal loans, through to the criminalisation of rape within marriage as late as 1991, or the ongoing struggle for entitlement for equal pay for equal work, which has still not been achieved, and in fact remains a problem even at this university. But each of these victories, despite advancing society in a certain direction, was Pyrrhic. Changes in the organisation of society have been combined with new, often more pernicious modes of gendered violence and domination. Patriarchy continues, and the most convincing and forceful struggle against it was defeated. I want you to think about how it could be that we have these two opposing views, one built on the history of defeat, of interruption, of failure, that given by the women who I knew as I was building archives, and the other built on a model of progress, that given by my student. One thing that I wanted to tell you today is that there are very many different ways that we can consider our relation to the past. I don't have time today to make arguments for each of these, but I do always like making lists. The list won't be exhaustive, although it contains many important views from the last few hundred years. No doubt you can also think of more ways of relating to the past too, and perhaps this is a good exercise. The past might be something we remember, or indeed that we forget, or have forgotten, or know that someone else has forgotten already, or know that someone else remembers, even if we don't. The past might be something we tell stories about, which in turn might be passed down from mouth to ear between generations. Sometimes these might have solidified into myths that everyone just gets to know, somehow. The past might equally be something we never mention or can't speak about. Even when we speak about myths, they might just be there to cover over something we are unable to say. The past might be something we want to align ourselves with, or it might be something we want to leave behind joyfully. Maybe we can think of that the past should be conserved or maintained. Maybe we think it should be destroyed. Could it not be that the past is just an accumulation of rituals and customs that it is our duty to continue, or which we will continue whether we like it or not? Perhaps we believe the past is intimately tied up with the present, and that in order to understand or give meaning to our present situation, we need to understand the past too. That would be a sort of argument for history. But even within history, we might have varying views. One might be that the past was a golden age from which we have declined in an endless fall from grace. One might be a world of endless progress, a past that was bad, which humans gradually made better, and that our present, too, must be criticised as part of this pattern of endless improvement. One might be of a world doomed to endlessly repeat itself, in which knowing the past simply means knowing what will inevitably come to pass again. What if the past represents a wrong for which you must atone? What if it represents a wrong that was done to you that must be assuaged? Do we even agree with each other about what the past is? One person might think that when we say the past, we simply mean all the things that ever happened. Another might think that we mean to describe how all the things that didn't happen were prevented from happening, remaining pure unfulfilled potentials, a sight less of what has been than everything that could have been but ultimately was not. Perhaps the past is merely a collection of conditions that will, on one final day, be called up before the all-seeing eye of the world judge. Or maybe even this moment at the end of the past will itself pass away into nothing. What if the past is heritage, a wealth passed down to you? What if it is a history of dispossession that has left you with nothing? And then we have questions about whether there really is a past in any general sense, or whether, in fact, the past is always more local, more particular. I might have my past, my ancestors, my homeland. You might have yours. We might have a national past, with its own shape given in our own national languages. And what might it mean if I make a claim on your past? Or if I say that your past does not matter? What if I say it is all part of a past that is shared, unable to be divided or possessed? What if, even if the past is universal, I contest what it contains? What might be the basis of such a claim? How might it be judged? I've brought you this list because I want you to understand that despite looking neutral, archives are persistently making claims on this very important territory of our relation to the past. Perhaps I can summarise the archival idea into 5 arguments. First, from the view of the archive, it's very important that the past can be known, or more precisely, it says that our relation to the past is one of knowledge. Second, that the whole of the past is nothing but human deeds. Third, even if the past cannot be presented in its fullness, if things in general continue to pass away, the archive has a view that its role is to preserve some trace or record of this past. We might say then that the archive is often interested in transforming what has been into information or data in a form appropriate to a view of knowledge. Fourth, in order to make these records or traces knowable, they must be put into some sort of order, governed by some system, taxonomy, or authority, all supposedly rational and accessible to search, research, or retrieval. Fifth, the archive sets out its relation to the past as a universal and neutral one. As such, it disparages and outcompetes all other relations to the past as being local, particular, or merely superstitious against the universal claims to knowledge. What I want you to get a sense of is that each of these 5 arguments can be criticised. In fact, in the last 30 years or so, the criticism of these few arguments has been very important, both in the humanities and also in the visual arts. And it can be helpful to think about what these criticisms might look like, or what consequences they might have. In part, becoming familiar with some of these arguments will help you to understand a lot of the art that deals with archives, or what to think about this strange space in which we might at once have artworks that are in archives, and then there are artworks that have been excluded from archives, so making archives for them becomes a sort of social practice art project of its own, which at the same time levels an accusation against the archive's mode of inclusion, showing that far from being neutral and universal, its systems exclude and are particularistic. And so we also have projects that show that where the archive looks neutral, it in fact persistently wields its authority about what is and what isn't included in the historical record. And alongside this, we might find more rebarbative works of art, those which fuck with the archive, hack or jam it, undermining its systems of storage or classification. When I was growing up and reading a lot of critical theory as a teenager and into my 20s, this was pretty much the trendiest topic. In the 1980s and 1990s, we get the invention of memory studies as a discipline. And perhaps the most famous intervention on archives here is a book by Derrida called Archive Fever, which came out in the mid-1990s. And at the same time, these critical arguments quickly made their way into modes of artistic production. You might, at some point, come across an important article by Hal Foster called An Archival Impulse from the end of the 1990s, which presents the work of a number of artists working through these problems in archival forms. This artistic engagement with archival forms, and I should add also a curatorial engagement with the archive, really has continued since this time, right into the present, and in some places has become the dominant mode of artistic production, although it is increasingly being criticised. If you want to read a really good recent criticism of this sort of art, there's a piece by Claire Bishop called Information Overload in her new book, which is also up on the Art Forum website. What you'll find in a lot of these critical works on archives, both in visual art pieces and across the humanities, is that they are often rather less analytic than I'm being here. Very frequently, you will find work that says, all at once, well, the archive doesn't properly include this history, and even if it did, its systems of classification wouldn't be able to grasp it properly. And even if its classification systems were made to grasp it, the disenchantment involved in the relation of knowledge alone, which treats this object as a piece of dead nature under a scientific gaze, excludes understanding people or experience, or the mode of transforming this history into information or data has done such damage to the thing, has dominated it so fully that the archival trace is no longer representative. And even if the archive were to expand to try to include this in such and such a way, it still tries to contain it within a mode of treating the past that makes everything almost flat, takes the spikes and fangs and fire out of the thing. So maybe we really do need to get rid of the archives altogether if we're to do a sort of riotous, explosive history. And as you can see, it's easy to imagine that the archive as such has undergone the most wide-scale intellectual assault in the past 30 years. Sometimes this has been a purely theoretical affair. Sometimes it has involved testing and experiment in the archives, or the development of new and different archival modes. In almost all cases, even where the archive has been thoroughly disparaged, its criticism seems to have been very fruitful. Sometimes this might be the case of the old story: if something is falling, then give it a push. But it's worth remembering that the development of these critical views often rely as much on the archive as they push against it. As I told you earlier on, one way of thinking about the archive is as an Enlightenment institution, and holding this in mind can help you disambiguate some of these criticisms. Some might be interested in a genuinely counter-Enlightenment thought, which undoes the very principles of equality, openness, and universal knowledge. Others might work as a corrective. They might say, the archive is less universal than it thinks, and in fact enacts a colonial power that excludes, and therefore needs to become more universal. Some might simply diagnose that the modes of rationality that the archive engages in are damaging or irrational. All of this might seem very abstract to you. Indeed, everything I've said to you so far is quite abstract, so I'm now going to turn to some very concrete examples for us to think about archives. These will all be drawn from my own work in and around archives and as an archivist. I've mentioned frequently in this lecture that central to the idea of archives is some kind of notion of order. Perhaps some of you will have learnt some Greek at school. You might know that the word archive has a relation to the word arche, which has to do with being a first principle, a cause, or has to do with leading. Archons were the magistrates of ancient Athens, so a certain kind of lawgiver, as well as a keeper of records of the law. And the sense of leading is preserved in words like archbishop or patriarchy or monarch. I want to suggest that the need for an archive presupposes a certain type of anarchy or anarchy, a lawlessness, an unruliness, or a disorderliness of the materials that it hopes to organise, give an order to, or rule in its system of classification. In making history into information, it also forces it into a shape of conformity. But sometimes, I want to suggest, the disorderly gets through. Recently, I've been writing about a magazine from the 1970s called The Black Liberator, and this research has involved finding the traces of British Black Power movements by visiting a lot of archives in the UK and the Netherlands. Often the materials produced by these movements are scant, so I found myself instead with sources written from elsewhere. In the National Archives, I found a witness statement from the court case of Regina versus Francis Anderson, Lecointe and Spencer, after a number of Black Power activists were arrested when a mass of police officers raided a reggae party in Oval in South London in 1970. The witness statement reads, "At about 11:25 p.m. that evening, Police Constable 128N brought into the police station charge room a man of colour who I now know to be Leonard Anderson. Because of his violence in the charge room, I had him restrained while I searched him and then placed him in a cell. In his inside jacket pocket, I found several items of literature, namely one small red book with lettering on the front cover, quotations from Mao Zedong, which I produce as Exhibit 1. One pamphlet headed Ireland, British Troops Out Now, which I produce as Exhibit 2. One book with lettering on the front cover, A Message to You, Rudy, which I produce as Exhibit 3. One booklet with the words The Political Economy of Women's Liberation by Margaret Benston printed on the front cover, which I produce as Exhibit 5. One pamphlet headed The Definition of Black Power, which I produce as Exhibit 6. And a pamphlet headed Organised Action in Self-Defence, which I produce as Exhibit 7. To me, this is the most wonderful of archival finds, because in a way it contains a sort of archive within an archive, or at least a sort of trace of a list of resources that were once contained in the inside pocket of a Black Panther in South London in 1970. Even in the process of dehumanising this man, his cultural and intellectual world, replete with Maoism and feminism, the Irish struggle against colonialism, rock-steady music and Black Power, gets through. If the archive accords in general with the law, then this witness statement, composed by a police officer, contains something of another view, a sort of counter-archive or counter-information deemed illicit. I also want to point here to the sort of thing that a state archive might contain. If you go to the National Archives, you can find lots of the papers of government and of the court. But if you want to go looking for normal people and their lives, most often you can find them only where they have, through misfortune or ill judgment, become caught up in the law. We might say, then, that the archives are organised from above and often populated from below. And this means that they're set up in such a way that the true view from below is rarely contained in them. Nowhere might we easily find an archive of the records of the views of people of colour who have been over and again persecuted and violently assaulted by the police, except refracted through the documents of the police. There is no autonomous record of their experiences contained in a scheme of knowledge quite different from the witness statement and apart from the immediate violence of restraint. And what of their lives and experiences outside of its interaction with the forces of the law, the state, and property? Often we are contained in the archive against our will, or on terms not of our choosing. Think, for example, of those great banks of data that gather the footage of every CCTV camera that catches sight of you in a day. Think of how little these represent your view of yourself and your view of the world. I now want to turn to an artist and a historian and an archivist who was mentioned briefly in last week's lecture. His name is Terry Dennett. He remains little known today, and what is known of him is as a collaborator with the feminist photographer Jo Spence. Both of them had day jobs as commercial photographers. Spence ran a high street portrait studio, while Dennett was a scientific photographer, working for a long time at London Zoo. However, outside of these day jobs, the pair of them were involved in a wave of politically radical documentary photography and filmmaking that occurred during the 1970s. In the mid-1970s, they founded the Half Moon Photographers Gallery in East London and were instrumental in establishing the magazine Camera Work. They also published books together, such as Photography Politics 1. As was mentioned last week, Jo Spence died very young of breast cancer, and after 1992, Dennett established the Jo Spence Memorial Archive in the flat where they had lived in Islington. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what became of this archive, but I will say that Spence's work, and this was work that was almost always collaborative, was extracted from it when the archive was bought wholesale by a commercial gallery many years after her death. I'm not convinced that Dennett ever received payment for it that he was promised. By the end of his life in the 2010s, Dennett was nearly blind and living in poverty, still in the same flat in Islington, and I was a part of an effort to conserve what remained of the archive, both his and Jo Spence's. Let me show you an image, and we can think about some archival problems. Here is a photograph of a couple of policemen, gone over with felt tip. A border is marked in felt tip too. Now, this photograph arrived with me in a box full of similar photographs, photograms and photo paintings. To me, these are stunningly beautiful, and also, from an archival perspective, they are rather unusual. Perhaps other such boxes exist in archives, but even if they do, they would be very hard to find. I want to think carefully for a moment about the categories under which an archival object might be classified, what we call metadata. You will know the same idea from using a library catalogue too. Each book will be labelled, for example, with a title, an author name, a publisher, a year of publication, a location of publication, an ISBN, and so on. What I want you to appreciate about this picture that I'm showing you is that it's incredibly resistant to these sorts of systems of classification. It has no author, no title, no date. Even if it had a name, it might just be a first name, Jake, aged 7, or Donna, aged 5. Perhaps I can note down that it includes an image of the police, so a sort of descriptive classification, or that it was created by a child, or that it arrived with me in a box full of other such works by children. You can imagine how, within the sort of ordering of the archive, this type of object becomes almost irretrievable, when we invariably start our research by looking for a name, a date, or a title. Maybe you will say that everyone has seen art made by children. but we don't often ask what becomes of it. Some is usually pinned with a magnet to the front of a fridge until it deteriorates. Most never leaves the home. The productions of children are not in any way taken seriously and are condemned forever to a sort of private darkness. It's not a surprise either, in a world that takes so little interest in the intellectual lives of children, the things they make, their relationships, politics and views onto the world. Perhaps one problem is that the world of children and the shape of childhood experience is quite different from adults. Think now of the world of children's games and the ways of thinking passed from one child to the next and then almost as quickly forgotten as the child grows up. How different this is from the type of information or the shape of history made and imagined by adults. There's a very beautiful film about precisely this made by a man called David Hammond. He filmed the street games of children in Belfast in 1971, and amid these ancient games and customs, you can glimpse only briefly the war that is starting in Northern Ireland in these years, in which these children will inevitably be caught up. Maybe the shape of children's experience could give lie to certain other conceptions of history. Perhaps this all sounds very strange to you, and I've picked up on children here really only as just an example of a social group who are often very much excluded from the archive, and they are one of many. But I would like to stick on this topic for a while, because it happens to be very important for the work of Terry Dennett, and it can maybe help us to think about archives a little, and a more general view on some questions about archives, documentary photography, community art, and its politics. Now, let me tell you a little more about this photograph of the police officer that I showed you, because even if I can't find a way to adequately classify it, to transform it into mere information, I can tell you something about its history. It came from a workshop in Stockwell in South London, which Terry Dennett ran in 1975, just up the road from where that Black Panther reggae party was 5 years earlier. These workshops certainly were not rich and did not have enough money to provide cameras for all the children. So, Dennett was involved in designing photographic technologies that allowed children to use things they found in the home as photographic equipment. Alongside some materials he clearly stole from London Zoo, there are instructional manuals he produced on how to make cameras out of jam jars, Wellington boots and boxes, as well as how to make developing fluid from vitamin C tablets. It might be difficult to discern a politics here, but I want to try to do that. Terry Dennett and Joe Spence first met when Terry visited something called the Children's Rights Workshop, where Spence had worked since 1973. You almost certainly haven't heard of the children's rights movement, but alongside the women's liberation movement in the 1970s, there was an incredibly rich and interesting political liberation movement for children. Sometimes it involved school strikes, sometimes it involved the production of media, sometimes it meant the development of organisations. Almost all of this history has today been forgotten or remembered only in outline. And while I can find a pantheon of the most interesting artists and activists of the time who contribute to its shape, even with the archives I have, the children seem to get lost and have become untraceable. But I want to suggest that the structure of these photographs I got from Terry Dennett are a bit like the literature found in the Black Panther's pocket. They are a sort of archive within an archive, a documenting of the world as seen by children through the lens of a jam jar. That is to say, precisely where these pictures elude the usual classification schemes, they become a sort of memory of a view into the world, now no more, now forgotten, now not even with anybody to remember it. Maybe one day the politics became explicit, these children's views of the world transforming into a practice to change it. In 1981, just 6 years later, the streets around the old photography project erupted into the riots as a result of police harassment and violence towards young people of colour. I might think of those children, now teenagers, in this scene. As I mentioned, both Spence and Dennett were very involved as educators and artists in the children's rights movement. But they also went on to be involved in a whole movement of political documentary photography. Almost all of this work was collaborative in one way or another. Spence was in a group called the Hackney Flashers, a collective of feminist photographers who would produce exhibitions including Women and Work and Who's Still Holding the Baby. Meanwhile, Dennett created a short-lived journal called The Worker Photographer. He organised with striking workers at Ford's in the plant at Dagenham, where there were a lot of strikes in these years. And once again we find him handing out cameras, helping workers to produce agitational political slideshows. The magazine Camera Work makes this explicit in an issue on photography in the community, and here again you can spot a photograph of a child with some cops, which seems to have become a thematic image. Once again, the issue contains instructions and recipes for DIY photography equipment. Meanwhile, it portrays communities in struggle, now the predominantly Bengali community of East London standing off against the fascist organisation, the National Front. In the 1980s and 1990s, we can find Dennett undertaking even more projects that start to look increasingly like archives, perhaps even something dragged out of the 18th century into our present. One, called the Crisis Project, documents the degradation of the city under conditions of economic crisis. Another documents the lives of rough sleepers and the food that they eat. Meanwhile, Dennett will quietly work on a project that he never finished, a working-class encyclopedia, one which also traces a sort of underground history of worker photography and its cultures. There is a great young art historian called Johanna Klingler who is currently working on this material and will publish it soon. One thing that you might notice about the nature of this collaborative work that Dennett is doing is that it is almost always unfinished and complex. The sorts of divisions between the completed work and work in progress is undermined. Files are filled with technical documents, contact sheets marked up, proofs of publications pasted together, scrawls of jokes. There are no longer clear authors and artists, but instead a social process intent on capturing for political purposes all that is left out, the blind spots and waste products of the processes of the state. You will have understood, hopefully, from the first half of this lecture, that there are some very severe criticisms that can be made of the archival impulse. But with this discussion of the world of documentary photography, perhaps you will have noticed that in a lot of cases, the criticism of archives also starts to look rather a lot like an archive itself. And in some cases we can see this explicitly. While in some cases the supposed rationality of the system of classification is challenged by some form of information that finds itself impossible to contain, in other cases its supposed universality is challenged by the emergence of archival work that is either suppressed or ignored by the state. Sometimes the information contained in the archive is challenged by politically motivated forms of counter-information, a media or technique capturing what cannot otherwise be seen. And I take this to be the sort of project that is intended by the history of political documentary photography, which too is involved in a sort of transformation of a view of the world into a type of information, albeit one that is used variously for propagandistic and counter-propagandistic purposes. Sometimes this counter-information is meant for a general public in order to show up the lies of some other authority. But sometimes it is meant for a particular group, as fugitive knowledge, issuing its own authority. I have also shown you that one of the moves that is made within this political documentary tradition is a move into the community. And alongside this, today we also see the wide-scale emergence of community archives outside of the purview of the state. Their relation to state archives is sometimes somewhat strained. Some of them will try out experimental modes of classification and anti-classification. Others have ended up as old-fashioned archives once again, and in fact their archival presentation is supposed, as in the case of an exhibition like Women in Revolt, to lend credence or authenticity to an image of radicalism. Partly I just wanted to suggest that there is a very important through line that can be drawn between this political movement of documentary photography in the 1970s and the beginnings of a certain type of community art and the sorts of critical or not so critical archival art that we see today. We might try to think this history also within the schemes and problems of enlightenment. Maybe that enlightenment that operates at the level of the state in the 18th century is resisted at the level of the community from the 1970s onwards. But we can also see a process of enlightenment and its opposites even within this resistance, and these processes too will depoliticise the notion of the community so that it might become something to display as a mere archival trace, making sure that it is dead and doesn't threaten to spring to political life anymore. It's kept under glass somewhere in a gallery in Edinburgh or even in a university. Meanwhile, some of this information art simply becomes a further technical system of surveillance and containment of communities. Even the history of children's rights that I've given you, which I told you might resist archivalism of a sort, has turned in this lecture into a sort of archival presentation. To close, I just want to mention what some of this means in regard to the city, which has been our real big object this term. I will keep this very brief, as you will have probably thought through this problem a little with regard to the reading for your seminars, which deals also with some problems of archivalism and anarchy and the history of squatting, and the city as itself an archive of its own occupation. One of the things I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture was about Linnaeus and his index cards. I told you about how one of the reasons for the format of this object was that the thing that he was studying, life itself, was hugely complex and unfinished and perhaps unknowable in its entirety. I then noted that history was also such a complex object, hence the archive's adoption of the same system. I simply want to point to the fact that the city itself is also just such a complex object. Perhaps one might suggest various classificatory systems for it, a map, for example, in order to reduce it to mere information, to make it in some way usable or traversable. But more than this, the real point behind this thought is that even if archives or taxonomies or maps deal in highly complex unfinished forms, one of their greatest benefits is that they maintain something of this unfinishedness and complexity. You will see this in the best of the archival and counter-archival art that you look at too, and you will see why interventions into this sphere of information management and the undoing of information management has seemed like a pressing intellectual and artistic project. Perhaps you will notice too that this world of information management, the very system of systems, is today its own sort of complex, unfinished and unfinishing totality of a variety we can only get a hint at from the strange shape of the internet.